Welcome to the third episode of Podnutz Daily. In this episode, we're going to talk about computers overheating and the effects on the motherboard. First off, how do you know if your computer's overheating? There's a few symptoms you could look for that will tell you your computer's overheating. The first thing is your computer shuts off. You might be running it for 10, 5, maybe 20 minutes, and then all of a sudden, the computer shuts right off completely, power goes dead, screen goes blank. That's a good sign that your computer has overheated. Another less obvious sign is just that the computer freezes, but will not shut down on itself. This is a good indicator that your computer is overheating too. But mainly, you want to look for shutoffs. The processor, in conjunction with the motherboard, usually has a protection mechanism that will tell the computer to shut down once it gets past a certain temperature. Make sure your computer has that and it's turned on, because if it's not, you might fry your processor or your motherboard. You can check in the computer's BIOS to see if that's turned on. Another less common symptom of overheating is that your computer won't turn on. And this will probably happen after it just powers down because it overheated and you try to turn it back on quickly. If you let the computer cool down a little while, you'll see that it'll turn on, run for 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, and then shut off. Okay, so what do you do if your computer's overheating? Well, the first thing I do is I look at the processor, and specifically I look at the CPU fan and the heatsink on top of the processor. So take the 2 screws off the side of your case, or however you get your case open, and look at the fan on top of the processor. If your computer is suffering from overheating, you're probably going to see that there is a ton of dust that is just caked in under the fan and on top of the heatsink where the processor is. And what that does is it stops the flow of air from the fan, and it causes the processor to get too hot, and then the computer overheats and will probably shut down on you. So you can either take a can of compressed air and blow through underneath that fan and just blow all that dust out of there and clear it out as best as you can. I mean, you might even have to use a whole can sometimes. Just get all the dust that you could possibly get out of there so there's a clean flow of air to the processor. If there's too much dust in there, or you're a smoker so the dust is sticky and doesn't come off with the compressed air, a lot of times if a user is a smoker, the dust that collects inside the computer doesn't easily come off when you try to blow it because it's sticky from the cigarette smoke and tar. You might have to actually take the fan and the heatsink off the processor and clean it out a different way, either with maybe a vacuum or a rag or something like that. Just get all the dust out from under the fan. If there's any other indicators inside the computer, though, that there is a lot of dust on other parts, maybe you could just clear all the dust out of every part that you see in the computer. Now turn the computer back on and see how it runs. Hopefully you should be fine now, but you might find that your computer's suffering from the same symptoms. It might run for 5, 10, 15 minutes and then turn off again. Well, in this case, we're going to have to inspect the motherboard, because it could be that the computer got so hot and the processor got so hot that it affected the motherboard and might have blown some capacitors on the motherboard. So go ahead and open your case again if you didn't already close it, and get a light, or get in a spot where you have good light, and take a look at the motherboard. Now, when a computer gets too hot, it blows the capacitors out on a motherboard, and you could usually see this in plain view. Take a look at the capacitors that are right next to where the processor is. There's usually 5 or 6 big ones in a line, and look to see if they have the tops of them have kind of exploded open, or even look like they're close to exploding. And then you're going to see a goo that kind of has oozed out after the capacitor is exploded. Right then and there, you know that your motherboard is now damaged, and we're going to have to handle that. If you don't see any blown capacitors, take a look at the whole top of the motherboard and look at every capacitor on the motherboard and see if there's anything in there that is blown. And like I said, you can usually tell because the top is exploded and there's a dark goo that has leaked out of the top. If you don't see anything out the top, sometimes capacitors explode out the bottom, and they're a little trickier to see, but it might be deceiving. You might think, oh, there's nothing wrong with my motherboard, and then if you look at the capacitors and you see that that ooze has come out the bottom instead of the top, or the bottom has blown out of the capacitor instead of the top, then it's the same problem. So what do you do if the capacitors are blown in your motherboard? Well, there's two things you could do. You can replace all the bad capacitors, and that usually handles the problem. When you replace the capacitors, you're going to have to replace them with the exact voltage and farads or microfarads of the original capacitor that's in there, because you don't want to put anything that's not rated properly into the motherboard, because you might have the same problem, or the motherboard could suffer even more damage. If you're good with soldering and if you've done it before, the cheapest way out is to replace those capacitors. And if you do replace the capacitors and the motherboard still doesn't work, then they're looking at a new motherboard. If you don't know what a capacitor is, then you probably don't want to do the job of replacing them and soldering them onto the motherboard. But if you're familiar with electronics and you know you can do it, I would go for it. Take a look, do a Google search for capacitors, maybe if you aren't familiar with them, and take look at Google Images for capacitor, and you'll see what a capacitor looks like, and then you have an idea what to look for on your motherboard. Another thing to check is maybe your fan has stopped on your motherboard, and that's why the processor's overheating. This is a usually easy thing to tell, though, because the computer will be a lot quieter usually when the fan has stopped. But power the computer up while the cover's off, and take a look at the fan, and just look at the fan on the processor and make sure that it's spinning. Okay, let's move on a little bit to overheating in laptops. Now, this is a little bit of a different animal, because if the components on a laptop get damaged, it might not be that easy to replace them. But you're probably going to see that there's just a clog of dust that's stopping the flow of air from the fans to the processor. The way I like to check for if there's dust in the laptop is to take a flashlight and shoot it in the hole on the bottom of the laptop where the fan is. You'll see a little vent where the fan pulls in its air. Take a light and shine it right in that hole. Then take a look on the side of the laptop, and you'll see another group of slits or a grate or a hole, and that is where all the air that the fan for the processor in the laptop is blowing all the air through that hole and out the side of the laptop. So take the light and shine it on the bottom of the laptop, and then take your eyes and look in the side of the laptop through the hole in the side and try to see the light. Shift the light around at the bottom of the laptop and make sure it's pointing in that hole, and if you can see the light, then the clog probably isn't too bad for the dust. If you can't see that light, then you know there's a wall of dust blocking the airflow, and then you have to take action. Now, my number one recommended way of getting all that dust out is to actually open the laptop and look at the fans, pull out the fans and pull out the heatsink, and get that dust out by hand, manually. Now, what also works but is not as highly recommended is getting a can of compressed air and blowing it in the fins of the heatsink that are leading to the cooling fan of the processor. There's usually a little grate or a vent on the side of your laptop